Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. I'm Jelke Boesten. I'm a professor of gender and development in the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy, and I lead the Gender Studies Network. I'm very honored to welcome you here today for our discussion, Women's Contributions to Economic Growth, with the question, is the government missing a trick? So today's gathering holds special significance as we celebrate the winners of the Brenda Trenowden Feminist Analysis Essay Prize, which is an annual award that recognizes exceptional feminist research and analysis written by King's College students, undergraduate and postgraduate students. The prize is a collaboration between the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which is well presented here, the Gender Studies Network, which I represent, and the online editorial Feminist Perspectives, which is led by PhD students from the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. Now, we planned this event to come just after the UK's first female chancellors delivered her inaugural budget. This historical moment was to provide a fitting backdrop as we examine how women's economic empowerment drives not just equality, but national prosperity. Unfortunately, this day is now overshadowed by the US election, where the population of what still is the most powerful nation on earth elected a convicted criminal, corrupt and incapable, old white misogynist and racist to become its president again. This is ever more upsetting as we are here at a feminist gathering, because the diverse population of the US, and I'm particularly thinking of the Latino population, have showed that they preferred him over super qualified black woman. That hurts. So while we are celebrating, of course, our female chancellor and her budget, and we do celebrate the many achievements of our panelists here today, and we look to the future with hope for our fantastic prize winners, but I do feel that today it costs a little bit of extra energy to do so. So let's put the energy in. The Feminist Analysis Prize honors a remarkable champion of gender equality, Brenda Trenowden. Her vision extended beyond corporate leadership to championing broader diversity and inclusion across sectors. Today's discussions then continue her legacy in turning ambitious goals for equality into concrete reality, ever more important in today's world. As we face ongoing economic challenges globally, the evidence is clear. Failing to fully engage women's talents and potential isn't just an equality issue. It's a political and an economic imperative that we can't afford to ignore. The barriers to women's participation aren't just holding back individual careers. They're hampering our collective potential for innovation, growth, and resilience as a community of people. So despite the shadow of the US elections, we are very privileged here today to have assembled a distinguished panel to help us explore these barriers and, importantly, identify the policy shifts that are needed to foster a fairer and more resilient economy and political economy. We have with us Isabel Berwick, host and editor of the Financial Times Working It podcast. She brings deep insights into workplace transformation. We have Pavita as UK chair of the 30% Club, and she continues to drive corporate diversity at the highest levels. We have my colleague, Professor Ikpe, who offers crucial perspectives from development economics, while Erin Mansell brings vital policy expertise from the Women's Budget Group. I will invite our panelists onto the stage, and following our panel discussion, we will hear from our three exceptional essay prize winners who have also prepared a very brief intervention, and their analysis represents the fresh thinking that we need to advance gender equality in new and powerful ways. So it's now my pleasure to welcome our chair for today's discussion, the Honourable Julia Gillard, who is the former Prime Minister of Australia and chair of King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Julia, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Like me, from lack of sleep, because you spent far too many hours overnight watching the US election results come in, and I'm sure like me you're grieving the result. Actually, no better time for us to be together and to be discussing feminist issues and what we are going to do next. And certainly no better time to be honouring Brenda, who quintessentially was a fighter across her life. A fighter for women's equality, for recognition of women's contributions and women's leadership, a fighter against the illness that ultimately took her life, but she fought bravely for many, many years and consequently was with us for many extra years and continuing to make her contributions. So I think that spirit, Brenda's spirit, is with us as we have this discussion. I've got the opportunity now to turn to each of the panellists and to ask them a question, and then we're going to have some discussion across the panel, but then turn to you for your questions. So please, as you're listening, if something sparks an idea, get a question ready and we will have a microphone come to you at that stage. But at this point, I'm going to turn first to Pavita. And I know you've done so much work at the 30% Club. Brenda was absolutely pivotal to the work of the 30% Club. And for those of you who don't know it, this was and continues to be an advocacy and change movement to ensure that women are represented on corporate boards and in senior leadership in business positions. So drawing on all of that work that the 30% Club has done and your own experience, very senior experience in business, what have you seen that's effective to get companies to actually implement policies that not only recruit women, but retain women and advance women into senior leadership roles? And given so much has been achieved at the board level, what are you seeing as the next frontier?
Sure. I think the first thing I would say is that the thing that's really stands the UK apart is that we've taken a voluntary approach and it has been very successful, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. And specifically our campaign is about men and women working together, so it's never been just about women sort of speaking in a vacuum. We've made a lot of progress in the last 15 years. Lots of campaigners, organisations have worked towards better progress for representation of women on boards and at senior levels. But I think if I was to just pick out a couple of the characteristics or features that we see that make the most difference, the first I would say is that when you've got a senior team, so the CEO or the chair or the executive committee, that don't just talk about it, because lots of people do, just have nice statements on their website, but are really intentional and purposeful about what it is they want to achieve when it comes to improving representation. And by that, I mean they are actually comfortable talking about the problems that exist. So they will expose the gap, they will talk about the power gap, the pay gap, the promotion gap, and they won't pretend there's nothing to see here, because we see a lot of that as well. We fixed it on the board, it's all fine. We've got some women on the executive committee, it's all fine here. So I think those leaders that really will listen and are curious, it really works. The second thing I would say is that organisations that are prepared to really dismantle some of the systemic barriers that exist, because we know that when it comes to meritocracy, that can be a bit of a myth. So organisations, and I've worked in enough big companies to know that we can create really sophisticated systems that say, well, if we do that, it'll be fair for everyone. But that myth means that for women particularly, and for other minority groups, it isn't equal. And it's not a level playing field, and they're not reaching the same level at the same rate or in the same numbers. And the numbers play out to show us that. And then I think things like the pay gap, it's a really simple thing that organisations can fix. And a young woman who's 18 joining the workforce today will not see pay equity in her lifetime. And I think if we can still see that happening in organisations, there's a long way to go. And finally, I'd say culture. You know, when you've just mentioned what's happened in the US, when you have, you know, an all-male team, we know that those teams are more vulnerable to toxicity in their culture. And I think organisations are curious as to why are women leaving? What is it about the tone that's being set that means they don't want to succeed to the top? And in terms of where we've got to go, the UK has already met the target that was set at 45% of women on boards, which is fantastic. And the next level down is about 35%. The problem is that 35% is a big group of people. That's executive committees, and it's all the people that work for them. So that sounds good, but when you really dig into it, it's not that positive, because actually, when you really look at where are the women in those jobs, they're not in what we call the power jobs. So they're sitting in CHRO, HR roles, COO jobs, maybe marketing, maybe investor relations. They're not in the power jobs, which mean they can succeed to CEO. So in 2011 in this country, we had 5 female CEOs, and today we've got 11. One is interim and one resigned about 6 weeks ago. So the net progress is pretty dismal. And it's not because there isn't enough talent, because we know there are phenomenal women who are very capable of being CEOs. Something is stopping them getting there or wanting them to do those jobs, and that's the next push and drive that we're focusing on.
And just looking at, you know, the US election, we've seen in recent years, as part of the kind of hyper-partisanship in the US, some quite big pushes to roll back diversity, equity and inclusion measures in businesses, and indeed litigation to stop businesses adopting DEI measures. Are you concerned? Have you seen any sign of that emerging here in the UK in a way which would hold this progress back and jeopardise women's economic empowerment?
Yes, we are, in different ways, but I think the sort of sentiment of, well, aren't we done? I mean, that's probably the thing I hear. My colleagues who are here will say the same thing. The amount of times chairs say, haven't we done this now? And I'm like, no, we're going to get T-shirts that say we're not done yet. That's what Brenda would have wanted anyway. So, I mean, I think there's that, but I think the sort of anti-woke agenda is coming to the UK. There are organisations that are taking out their D&I teams, efforts to just purely focus on targets for women are being taken out. And I think there is an attempt to say, well, actually, if we're just really inclusive, the talent will naturally rise to the top. So we are starting to see that happen, and we are concerned about it.
Mm. And so let's continue the conversation, but broaden from looking at the UK, or even in the shadow of the US election. And Ikpe, I know that your work is right around the world, especially in African contexts, in the global south. And what are you seeing in the creative industries, in those emerging economies, about women's participation and the structural and practical constraints? And I'm interested both in women as employees, but also women as entrepreneurs.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. You know, I think a key thing to note is that, first of all, women creative entrepreneurs in the spaces where I've worked, and I'm thinking of Nigeria and Kenya, based on my research, but also a recent film project that I've been part of on creative women entrepreneurs in Lagos. They are really innovative leaders within their spaces. So they're participating in very high value-added activities. We can think of the ways in which they offer original and inclusive design. If you think of the sort of global value chain, you know, I guess phases or economic activities within those spaces, really involved in innovative design, really involved also in controlling marketing and sales processes using digital technologies. For instance, we see their use of social media, we see their use also of global payment platforms being really, really significant and important. My own work in fashion, we see what they do there in terms of leading in sustainability. So how they focus on small batch production, how they focus on really having production processes that are focused on integrity, so focused on the use of local inputs, the use of local suppliers as well. So I want to set that out, first of all, before we proceed. But then, with all that they're doing, all that they're trying to achieve, some of the challenges they face around that include being able to connect to that local source of inputs, being able to connect, for instance, if you think of those working in fashion, to the right kind of heritage textiles that would help them with that work in sustainability leadership, for instance, is a key element that we see. Another one that I think is very familiar to those working in creative economies in parts of the Global South, but I dare say here in the UK as well, is finance. Of course, this is a sector all of us enjoy creative output, but I think many feel like it's not something we have to dedicate resources to, and that's a huge problem, because what we find is that these women end up relying on family for these resources. Aside from that, they rely then on pluriactivity. So they have this interaction, this commitment to creative work, but have to get another job as a journalist, as a teacher, something else, not able to pay full attention to that work that they're trying to do. That's another challenge they have. And then finally, in terms of production, we see that what they do there, many of them tend to work on a very small scale, so they find themselves carrying out all the activities, whereas they also recognize that it'll be more efficient to collaborate with others who carry out similar activities and, in a sense, pool their resources around that. Now, in the work I've done, a lot of the solutions, so we come with the theories, with certain ideas, and we think we know it all. But actually going to these spaces, you find that a lot of the creative women entrepreneurs we're speaking to, they actually know what the challenge is and also know how we can go about addressing some of this. What we found was actually government policy came up a lot in the discussion about the responses and what would be helpful, and we're not expecting that. Because quite often there is a sense that these are small entrepreneurs, they'll sort everything out themselves, and they're doing a lot of that. It's incredible. I mean, I'd recommend watching our film to see more on that, but there is a lot that is needed to address the structural constraints that you mentioned in the question there. One aspect that we see is a focus on the government support that is available to making those inputs more accessible to them. So again, those working in fashion, they're thinking about others producing certain heritage goods that would support their activities. They also recognize that it might be useful to have government support to facilitate imports where those local inputs are not available. But I think what is critical to note is they're very committed to building backward linkages. They want to work with local suppliers. So they see that focus on imports as an interim measure and are keen to see in the long term a focus on building the sectors that would go on to support them. Of course, one that would not be a surprise is access to finance. So they want to see, it's interesting, they want to see greater resources that are made available to the creative economy specifically, but they also want to see finance instruments that are better structured to speak to the needs of the creative economies. So in our conversations, they did note that there was some access to finance, but sometimes what they found was the process for accessing that was so complicated and so difficult that those resources were there, but they would opt out of even trying to access those. So the training to be able to access those resources became a key point, but also some of those instruments were very short term and didn't make provision for capital investment, because there is an assumption that these are cultural goods or creative services. There is no need for certain forms of capital. And so this was a challenge. Also, the term of the finance that's available was another key point that was raised. And this is something they thought the state could address. Moving to the policy space, so if you think of monetary policy was another point that was raised around what access, what the state might be able to do to address currency depreciation. This is a big challenge, has been a big challenge across many parts of the continent. In Nigeria, one of the cases we've worked on is a huge problem in this moment where inflation is at about 33%. And a lot of that has been linked to the depreciation of the naira. So they thought the state could play a role in sort of smoothing out these shocks. Another point that was made was around fiscal policy. So what kind of stimuli might be made available where there are major shocks? So some of the work we did was during COVID, and a lot of the challenges they faced. Their point was around how it was the responsibility of the state to step in and address the challenges they faced, especially where we know finance is very tight in this space. Another key concern is with fiscal policy around taxation. And there was something specific around the I guess it's a trend we see now on the continent, but an understandable one, where digital services and digital activities are being taxed more constructively, and some of that is useful for the state to find a way to generate revenue for other uses. But the creative economies rely very extensively on digital platforms for their work, as I mentioned before, for marketing, but also for sales. So this is affecting them disproportionately, and so they saw this as a key point that would have to be addressed. A final point I will make is around education. So they mentioned that, again, the way in which creative economies tend to be treated, where the sector itself is not, we enjoy it, we celebrate it, but in terms of proper investment in formal education structures, but even supporting skills development, there are major challenges around that. So this was seen as another major concern. Actually, one other point to make, and I think this is really critical because we're talking about women entrepreneurs, was around the sources of finance that would also enable them to support their employees. So many of them made the point around how, for many of their employees, they were also a source of social welfare in spaces where this was not otherwise available. So they're having to provide microloans, having to provide support for healthcare, having to provide support for food in some instances. And the finance instruments available to them do not address or cover those things, but they need their staff members to come in to carry out what tends to be quite a labor of love, but they need to be able, they see that as their own responsibility because of the absence of those resources in other spaces.
Thank you very much. So we've had two perspectives. I'm going to turn now to talking about the budget. We've obviously just had the first UK budget delivered by a woman Chancellor, by Rachel Reeves, and I'd have to say in her hands that quite awkward red box ended up looking like it could be a very groovy bag. Maybe there's a fashion line that's ready to put them out as something that we could all have one, or maybe we could have little versions for girls so they could practice being Chancellor. But looking at the first budget, Erin, can you, from your Women's Budget Group perspective, give us the key headlines, and what did you think of the budget, looking through the lens of women and policies that truly work for women?
Yeah, thank you, and it's lovely to be here with you all. I think, as you said, I would just start with that. It's a big deal to have a female Chancellor, and in an area that is still very male-dominated, economics and kind of the Treasury, and it's one of the reasons, we, at the Women's Budget Group, our work is still, we think it's still so important because so often the kind of orthodoxy of economics is very much through a male lens, and so, when Rachel Reeves stood up and gave that initial speech about kind of girls looking up and seeing what was possible, I think that matters. So I just kind of wanted to start there. And also just thinking about your kind of opening question, is the government missing a trick when it comes to contributions, women's contributions to economic growth? I think for a long time we've been saying yes. Yes, the answer is yes. And with this budget, I think it's a bit of a more mixed picture. I think, I would start by kind of giving a bit of context of this government did come in after 14 years of austerity. To one extent or another, we know, that has had huge effects on our public services, particularly on kind of women's standard of living. You look at the women in the lowest incomes, Black and Asian and minority ethnic women, disabled women, lone mothers, have really seen huge diminishing kind of living standards as a result of cuts to public services, cuts to social security, and cuts to their own incomes, and changes to kind of the tax system. And so in the spring budget of the last government, what we saw was kind of, a pre-election kind of tax giveaway. We saw the cuts to national insurance, to employee contributions to national insurance on top of the previous budget that had done the same, and taken together, those that's a kind of loss to the Treasury of around 20 billion a year, and also again because of labour market inequalities, men earn more and so benefit more when they pay less tax. And on the other hand, women benefit more when we have greater tax revenues because they benefit more from the public services that those tax revenues fund. And women both tend to, because of the unpaid care they do and the people they care for, tend to rely more on public services as well as work in them and pick up the work unpaid when those public services are drawn back by the state. So it was also quite frustrating to see, you know, in the election, the Labour Party commit not to raise those taxes or not to undo the decisions that were made by the previous government, you know, because that could have been a kind of easy win to bring back some revenue to the Treasury. But we did need to see revenue. The other thing was, you know, as I think there was a bit of, obviously there was politics at the time around how big the gap was, but we did know that there was kind of around 20 billion at least, I think it was 2.3%, further cuts to public services, public sector spending that were built into the last government. So there was a huge need to find revenue. And so we thought it was good to see the kind of change to fiscal rules that were set out, which is kind of a bit of a nerdy point, but it basically, you know, in terms of the government being able to borrow more, to spend more, that was a change that also freed up some money to spend on the kind of day-to-day, as it's referred to, the kind of public service spending, and a kind of injection of cash for the NHS and schools. And again, you know, women work in those sectors and tend to rely on them more, and so that will have had a disproportionate benefit for women. We would like for the Chancellor to go further on those fiscal rules, and you know, some of this is about giving the markets confidence and so on, but actually we've always argued at Women's Budget Group that the kind of day-to-day spend, so the funding for the people inside the buildings as well as the capital spend on the buildings themselves, is also investment. That investment basically means you get a future return on what you spend today, and so you know, that's economic as well as the kind of benefits. Sure Start is an obvious example, right? So the kind of academic outcomes for children that had access to Sure Start Centre were better, which means they go on to earn more and, you know, contribute more to the economy. So we thought, yeah, we'd like to see those fiscal rules kind of go further. The change to the national minimum wage, so there was an uplift announced in the national minimum wage. 60% of the people on the national minimum wage are women, so that will have a disproportionate benefit for women. On the other hand, so the kind of broad kind of public sector, you know, the direction of travel on public spend is good. On the other hand, it was disappointing not to see more on social security, so there was very little. And again, because women contribute masses to the economy in unpaid work, they tend to rely more on social security. And so there were some benefits announced in terms of kind of a reduction in the amount that people have to pay back in their universal credit loans. But you could just scrap the 5-week wait, which is when people first, you know, go onto universal credit. It's paid in arrears, and so people have to, it's basically a loan, and then they have to pay back that loan, which means they have less in their pocket each week, which is, you know, it just doesn't make any sense. And there was also a change to the threshold in carers allowance, which has been, you know, one of the big scandals we've seen of people kind of, when they earn just over the threshold, which is a cliff edge, there's no taper, then they've ended up having to, the Department for Work and Pensions kind of taken back the money from people who are often also themselves on very low incomes. It was also, so the Chancellor announced an uplift in the total rate of benefits from by 1.7%, which is the kind of standard thing to do. They use the September inflation rate, but they also announced with the OBR's kind of projections that the average inflation rate was 2.5% this year and will be 2.6% next year. So again, that's actually a real terms cut. So for those groups that rely on social security, actually austerity isn't really over in this budget. And particularly worrying was a commitment to continue the savings to the disability benefit, the levels of disability benefit that the previous government made. So we don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but that will be deeply worrying to, you know, to disabled people and people caring for disabled people, because, you know, those families have had some of the biggest cuts since 2010. So yeah, I'll stop there. You know, there's a spending review coming, so there's opportunities to kind of push forward. And I think, you know, one of the lessons that I would say from what we've just seen happen in the US is that not making a big enough difference to people's living standards soon enough after the years of kind of diminishing living standards we've seen can have really troubling effects. And I think, you know, we know it takes a long time and the government is hoping for a two-term government, but yeah, we'd like to see much more ambition, and I think people need to feel that in their pockets sooner to really know that they've made a difference.
And just in terms of that, looking forward, I mean, Chancellor Reeves obviously very much pitched this budget as, you know, repairing the rotted out foundations so that there are strong foundations to build on. But if you could nominate one priority for the next budget which you think would maximise impact for women's economic empowerment, what would it be, if I just let you pick one?
Just one.
Just one.
I think it would have to be reversing the worst kind of decisions that were put in the social security system. So, you know, I'm slightly weaving around the one there, but if you look at the two-child limit, if you look at the benefit cap, the 5-week wait, you know, these are really regressive measures and are punishing the people who are already have been worse off because of decisions the last government made.
Yeah, and making it harder for them to potentially find a pathway back into work. And
exactly, and you look, you know, women, we know that, you know, if you equalise women's participation in the labour market with men across the UK, I think it would add around 100 billion to GDP. So having a social security system that doesn't support people who are working part-time, which is particularly women, you know, and most of the people on social security are in work, then, you know, you're just making life harder for them in terms of kind of accessing well-paid work and increasing the hours when they want to, you know, you kind of, it should support women into the labour market, and it's currently not doing that.
Thank you, thank you. Now, Isabel, turning to you, you've got another and different lens on this discussion, so we're coming at it all ways, which is fantastic. And your unique window is into workplace dynamics, and you've developed that through your Working It podcast. So what emerging trends are you seeing that could really reshape women's advancement in the workplace, and how do you see all of that evolving?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone. I did tear up what I'd written after last night. So I just wanted to come on what you said, Erin.
That's the most destructive thing you did. That's
so
really very modest.
I'm going to start with the UK and picking up on the budget, actually. Something that's emerging, we've been talking a lot at the FT this week about, and I'll probably cover in future, is this rise in national insurance contributions for employers, lowering the threshold. It's now cheaper to employ one full-time person than two part-time people. That's going to have potentially a massive impact. Obviously, I'm looking at it from the employer's point of view. They're very upset, they're worried. A lot of women should be worried. It might impact flexible work, which I was going to talk about as one of the huge things that's really helped women. So McKinsey did a report last year, and it actually showed that women's ambition has rocketed since the pandemic. Why is that? It is flexible work. So any rollback of flexible work is going to have a massive impact on women's ability to progress. And I think I'm optimistic that it won't be rolled back and that people like Jeff Bezos are outliers, because flexible work benefits everyone. It doesn't just benefit women, it benefits men too. And I think they've come to see that during the pandemic. You don't have to be present all the time. So that would be my first point. You know, the budget might have an impact on flexible work, or, you know, the kind of flexibility that we've come to accept and want. I don't know if that's really going to happen. There might be some rollback, but that's something to flag. So on the DEI point that Pavita already mentioned, what I would say is that it had already started to be rolled back in the States. We've already discussed this. Where I see it going is quite interesting, because there was a big report out from Columbia a couple of weeks ago, and it showed that management in the United States, and I think in the UK too, has moved leftwards or more progressive in the last 2 decades. So this is not virtue signalling. It is a demographic shift, and that's not going away. And that gives me hope that DEI is going to stay embedded. You know, companies that are not interested, and we're putting black squares on their Instagram in 2020 just to do that, they're going to stop. But actually that leaves the field clear for the companies that are interested, that are committed. And I don't think I can talk about DEI without talking about the failings of DEI, and I think You know, the idea of the woke mind virus that has really taken hold in the American electorate. You know, a lot of people have been very triggered by very small things that have happened in companies in terms of being progressive. So I think it's something that we all have to think about, you know, what is the best way to take DEI forward, and how will that benefit women and all the other people who are benefiting from a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So the trend I really like, and I think is really important, and actually Grace Lorden, just across the road at LSE, has done a lot of good work on this, is about transparent promotion and retention and diverse leadership. So leaders who actually promote people without bias. And that's a really hard thing because we're all full of biases. But I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of data now on what makes people progress, what makes people stay, and what makes women leave in particular. And companies who take notice of the data, I think, are really going to help women advance and other people advance, you know, to create a truly inclusive workplace. So that's the kind of plus side. On the minus side, I think the idea of leadership is at a really crucial point. So we talk about generative AI and all the things it's going to bring to our workplaces. A lot of those are going to be around automating and administration. It should, in the kind of techno-optimist view of the world, allow us more time to meet with our colleagues and our clients and have a much better time at work. And that requires a much more sophisticated degree of interpersonal relationships. Who is good at that? Often women. I don't wish to generalise completely, but really, yes. But, you know, there's a huge threat here in that the generative AI may make us all just work harder. It may not allow for more human relationships. So, you know, I think there's a huge opportunity here for the kind of leadership that women display in an age of generative AI to really come to the fore. And if we bear in mind that managers and leaders are going to have to be, you know, obviously process managers, performance managers, but also therapists in the future. The Gen Z, and there are many in this room, are coming into work and they expect their workplace to take care of their mental health as well as their career progression. That is a huge shift. Women are well placed to, you know, make the most of this, to support their staff, but it's a huge pressure on everybody. And I don't want to pretend that the workplace is going to be in a more amazing place in 5 years' time because of Gen AI. It probably will be, but it will also be a place where we talk a lot more about things we haven't traditionally talked about. And again, I think women are well placed for that. I'm going to wrap up there because I think we're over time. I could go on all night.
No, that's fine. I am just going to come back to you on one question. I mean, talking about the data, you're obviously singing our song from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership perspective. But for women who are looking from the outside, so, you know, they're thinking about work, thinking about careers. Obviously, not everybody has a huge range of choices about where they go to work, but if you do have choices, how is it that from the outside people can assess whether an employer is genuine about DEI, you know, introducing generative AI in a healthier way versus those that have done the, you know, tick box kind of DEI approach and now they're over it. You know, I think just conversations with, you know, friends, colleagues, people I know, there are a range of women who come to my mind who went into a new opportunity, you know, full of energy and vigour for it, and then didn't realise until they were in it what the work environment was actually like, and found that it was really a very negative one. So how can we know more about that in advance? Do you see their transparency moves that way?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Julia. I think one of the things you can do is go on Glassdoor, you can go on LinkedIn, you can start to build your networks in the sectors that you're interested in before you start work or when you're working. I'm a big believer in the power of networking, you know, not in a cheesy way, but in a way of, you know, people say stuff. You know, you hear, I think. The more you get out there, the more doors you open, the more doors open, I guess, and the more you find out. And I think you can never know for sure, but it really helps if you know a friend of a friend you can contact and message. And I think people should be doing, you know, I realise it's really hard to do, but honestly, I think it could save you from as you say, a toxic situation. And actually, a big pay rise is not a big pay rise if you have to pay it all in therapy.
No, it's not. And I mean, we're here honouring Brenda, and she personally made a difference to some very toxic workplaces. I mean, she entered the financial industry at a time when it was, you know, literally smoke-filled rooms and client evenings that involved taking people to strip clubs and all the rest of it, and she fought to change that and make a real difference. So, you know, I think thinking about how we can get even more sophisticated in people putting their time and energy into the workplaces that are getting it right is really important. So I think they've been very interesting contributions from everyone, very different sort of lenses and perspectives. But I'm going to throw it open now to you for any questions or comments, and then we'll just do a wrap up at the end before we move to the essay prize awarding section of the evening. So if anybody's got a question, please indicate, and a microphone will be brought to you. So we've got one here, and then we'll come to the front, please.
Yes, hello. I'm Jana. I'm a PhD student here at King's. Thank you so much for all these contributions. Speaking about DEI, to what extent do you think it's necessary to take along the people who feel so incredibly threatened by these important measures to improve diversity and inclusion? And if it is important, how do we best go about that?
Yes, we get it a lot, so I'm happy to take that question. You know, what about the men and what about us? And we have a colleague here who's a headhunter. I'm sure she's been told by lots of men, oh, there's no jobs I can get anymore. You know, I'm not going to make a short list. I mean, I think if you're in the majority group, we've had every opportunity for the last sort of 70 years. It's really hard if suddenly it feels like the playing field's being levelled and other people are being allowed in. But it is important to take that group with you. I mean, as I said at the beginning, our campaign was based on men and women working together. And in fact, we didn't start making any change in this country until the men who held all the power and were the chairs got involved and advocated and got their mates involved and started saying, yes, it's a good idea, we should have more women on boards in this country. That sounds like a sensible idea, because I hadn't actually thought about that beforehand. So it is really important, but it's a very sensitive conversation. I think it has to be handled well. And so the tipping point we're seeing now is, well, actually, no, it's not okay to have an all-women group. We should have a group where everyone feels they can come and be involved. Or if it's then some of it's good. If it's a caring responsibility or parental group, it's good to have men and women in the room. So I think there are elements where it's positive, where it's evolving, and I think there are others where the conversation is being suppressed and going underground. But it's always been critical to have those naysayers with you on the journey, because otherwise all it does is it gives a sense that a small group will think women are getting there through tokenism, and we've had that already, and that's why we didn't want quotas in this country, because nobody wants to feel they've been appointed for the wrong reason. We know there are as many talented women, but the talent's everywhere, the opportunity isn't, and it's about showing that data and showing that there's no reason why women are not, they should be progressing at the same rate at every level. I mean, as a pyramid narrows at the top and everyone's fighting for the same jobs, there's no reason why as many women shouldn't be getting through. If they're leaving, it's for other reasons, because they leave silently, not because they're not capable. But we see a lot of evidence that shows that the criteria which is applied to women is different. We've seen it overnight in what's happened in the US, the way that we've been heard descriptions about a female candidate and her lack of ability to lead, because no one thought she was qualified, against other candidates who had even less ability to lead at the point that they were which appointed. That happens in businesses all the time. So I think it's essential to take those people with you.
There's
this is my colleague.
Yeah, there's a macro sort of narrative point here, I think, for business, for politics, for all of it, about how we, and I don't have the answer, but how we speak about gender equality, which I think is generally heard as a project that is just about better circumstances for women, but properly understood is actually better circumstances for everyone, because a gender equal world ultimately will be a better world for everyone. But I think we've seen very weaponised in the political discourse that, you know, DEI is an instrument in a zero-sum game, and so if someone is winning, someone from a diverse background is winning, that means someone else is losing, and we've got to, you know, move on from that, you know, letting that narrative take hold, because I think we've seen some of the political consequences of that overnight. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. As a headhunter who often works with women, an issue I hear from a lot of them is the cost of childcare. Last time I looked, the UK was the most expensive childcare in Europe. And Erin, I'm interested in your perspective, but perhaps any of the other panelists, what we could do to get this as a higher priority in our fiscal policy. Obviously, it doesn't just benefit women, but it keeps a lot of women from staying engaged in the workforce, which really impacts their long-term economic contribution. And the Tories completely ignored this. And are we being optimistic to think that Labour might take this a bit more seriously?
Okay, Erin, fixing childcare in the UK, your time starts now.
I mean, I think you really saw the political pressure and salience of childcare costs growth coming out of the pandemic, partly because more the impact of kind of looking after children at home hit more people, including more fathers, and the impact on business was clear. You know, you saw organisations like the CBI lobbying for more investment in childcare, and also because, you know, childcare providers were, again, a kind of afterthought when, you know, when lockdown was happening and we were thinking about schools and everything else. No one thought about childcare for, I don't know how long it took, but it wasn't, it took a while. And then actually the last government did make a big announcement, and it was seen as a big a growth measure and assessed by the OBR as one of the biggest growth measures in that budget, which was spring last year, I think. And what we've seen from Labour is a commitment to continue with the rollout that the Conservative government committed to. And our concerns at Women's Budget Group have always been that that some of the reasons for the cost being so high is that the level of funding that the government provides for the kind of free hours to parents doesn't actually meet the cost of delivery of those hours for providers, and so they tend to charge parents for the hours outside of those. So you see costs go up for, you know, any of the extra hours or provision of meals or extra things, you know, in order for them to kind of make that back. So we have some concerns, and I think as the rollout expands, we'll hear more noises from providers and parents, and I think that pressure will grow again. But it could be, you know, we've always advocated at the Women's Budget Group for universal free childcare and shown the kind of economic benefits over time of providing that. I don't think you could do that now with the system that we have, but we'd definitely like to see more funding, kind of, rather than these slightly complicated systems, you know, where you're paying parents and local authorities, and that you would just see it, you just start to move it to more like school funding, where you're paying, you know, for the providers that provide a public service. And I had one other point and I forgot. Oh yeah, I think, you know, as you were saying earlier about some of the challenges around the national insurance contributions going up, that will also affect, so there will be funding for public services directly to cover those costs, but as you said, in employers and businesses, which includes providers in childcare and social care, where the majority of workers are women. And, you know, as I don't want to repeat myself on why those are important for women, but I think, yeah, there will be more pressures. And then you've got organisations like Pregnant Then Screwed and Fawcett, you know, continuing to put pressure. I think we need to keep it up the kind of media, political, you know, kind of imagination as an issue that's not going away. I think because of the kind of big announcements that were made and there's implementation of that happening at the moment, it's gone a bit quiet, but I think it will be back in a big way as things don't work out as they should.
Thank you very much. We've got another question back here, and just as the microphone's getting to you, I think, you know, the other lens on childcare, I mean, obviously it's an economic development question from a labour force participation, women's labour force participation angle, but actually if you can get quality right and early learning right, it's an economic development angle that way too, because we do know that if you are going to address any issues for children, the earlier you intervene, the better, and so quality early education programs can be very big, a very big assistance to overcome disadvantage, so quality offerings can help you in the long term too. But we've got a question here. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Ylva. I am a co-founder of a finance company. My question goes to female entrepreneurship. With less than £1 for every £100 invested in entrepreneurs and VC funding goes to female-led businesses. And also research showing that if you're pitching for money for female-targeted technology, femtech, you're more likely to get the investment if you have an all-male board than if you have women on your board. What can be done to eradicate the funding gap for female entrepreneurs?
Very good question. Do you want to take that one?
Yes. No, I mean, yeah, a global challenge. I think it's very clear to see that. You know, from what we've done, sometimes there is, that funding is actually available. It's actually there, but it's who is accessing it, who hears about it. In terms of, expanding the provision, of course, the key points that have been made about the contributions that, many women make in my own space, within the creative economies, the contributions that they make to those industries and to, in terms of GDP contributions more widely, has become a very important argument to put forward and to make. So to really connect that to, when you're having conversations about government policy around this, how does this speak to policies around industrial development? How will expanding investment in these spaces speak to those sorts of ambitions? How will this speak to also how the government might address education needs for, some of the points we've heard here already. How will it speak to some of those needs within that sphere? But from those that we've engaged with, a lot of their point was the provision that is there already. How do you make that more accessible to the women that actually need that and can use it? How do you repurpose some of that? So you have provision available. Repayment has to take place over 2 years. That isn't feasible, and they end up not applying for that at all. We're seeing in many of the spaces I work with, those you wouldn't expect to provide that provision, that's happening. So we see multilateral development banks turn their attention to some of the activities that creative women entrepreneurs especially are participating in. The African Development Bank, their work in fashionomics, for example. So there is a need to actually highlight the significance of this work, and those that do have those resources and are able to redirect some of that. We're seeing some of that happen, but there is need for that narrative around the work that these women are doing, what larger contributions that makes to the economy. That's where we see the expansion in some of these provisions, certainly in my work.
Absolutely. And on that, the female tech, I do think in light of the US election, we need to diversify some imagery of who is in the lead in technology. We've seen a very particular form of imagery in recent weeks, and it's a pretty alienating one for most women, so there's a lot to do there too. Now, I know that there are hands still up, but unfortunately we are going to have to move at this point, because we do have our essay winners to honour, and I know that we're looking forward to hearing their contributions. So if I could ask you to join with me at this stage in thanking the panel for their excellent contributions. Thank you. I'll stay, but I will hand over.
Thank you, Julia, and what a great panel. That was fantastic. I'm Timber Box, and I identify as a friend of Brenda, and I'm delighted to be here. Today, I have the honor of announcing the winners of our Feminist Essay Prize, which has been newly renamed this year to commemorate the pioneering work of the wonderful Brenda Trenowden. Brenda was a kind and passionate leader and a tireless advocate for gender equality. Alongside her hugely successful career in financial services, which has been referred to, she constantly championed feminism, not just in business, but also in sport and across the range of charities and interests in which she was involved. As global chair of the 30% Club, she oversaw the achievement of the goal of 30% female representation on the FTSE 100. She also extended that goal into the FTSE 350, as well as increasing the focus on broader diversity in boards. But her support for gender and diversity initiatives went well beyond the world of the UK PLC. She was a trustee of the EY Foundation, helping young people into employment, the senior independent director at the England and Wales Cricket Board, improving access to the game, and a trustee at the Royal Marsden Cancer Charity. But just as importantly, she was an adoring wife and mother and a brilliant hype chick to all her girlfriends around the world. In short, she was, and she is, an inspirational role model to us all. In her honor, therefore, I am thrilled to announce our winners, each of whom will give us an overview of their research and their future plans. So I'm going to start with third place. In third place, we have Tian Li for her insightful essay examining mobile menstruation recording applications used by Chinese women. While Tian couldn't actually be with us in person today, she is watching along online. Welcome, Tian. And we're going to hear about her research in her own words with video.
Hello everyone, I'm Tian Li, a postgraduate student from the MA program Digital Culture and Society at King's. I'm truly honored to have been awarded the third prize in Brenda Trenowden Feminist Analysis Essay Competition. I would like to express my gratitude to the Gender Studies Network and King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership for hosting this session. Today, I want to discuss the rise of mobile tracking apps focusing on menstruation and fertility, part of the growing femtech industry. These apps normally allow users to log daily qualitative data like physical symptoms and provide a trackable history with a standard criterion for comparison over time. Here, the framework of big data and the promise of understanding women's own bodies better based on scientific standards are noticeable. While menstrual cycle apps may help to disrupt shame associated with menstrual objections and assist with achieving pregnancy and contraception, their gendered design and the restricted understanding of sexuality has been criticized. For example, the euphemistic humor incorporated in the interface of flow and clue has been found that it may risk strengthening entrenched stigmas and stereotypes around menstruation. My essay specifically examines a Chinese fertility and period tracking app named as Meet You. It ranked third after Flow and the period calendar app among the most popular period tracking apps for global users in 2023, with over 823,000 downloads. Although rising in popularity and usage, Meet You has yet to be critically examined. Therefore, I focus on its content, its functions, and uses by mimicking the everyday use of this app. Meet You advertises that its mission is to make Chinese women more beautiful and healthier with the assistance of its 4 modes of use, targeting different groups of female users, such as users who want to be alerted and preparing for the next period, and users who want to concept and users who already are pregnant and they want to gain more parenting knowledge. This essay then highlights the various and powerful discourses of encouraging women to monitor their bodies in terms of menstruation and fertility to achieve better self-care and self-control that entice women to act as reproductive subjects. About my future plan, I'm currently applying graduate programs in the area of media and communication with particular attention to gender and popular culture in China. I wish to contribute to discussions about the influence of the new liberal sensibility on women's understanding of their own bodies and leisure activities. I'm also interested in transnational feminist advocacy in East Asia context. Recently, Korean feminists have resorted to Chinese social media platforms to expose deepfake sexual crimes and collaborated with Chinese feminists and women gamers in expanding the visibility of news about illegal egg retrieval and embryo transfer operations this year in September at Qingdao. That's all. Thank you again for this recognition.
Fantastic. Thank you. In second place, we have Lisa Lefebvre-Rizzo for her compelling and rather timely analysis of which factors can explain women's political representation. Lisa, please come to the stage and present your research and future plans.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight to celebrate the remarkable work of Brenda Trenowden. I'd also like to thank the Gender Studies Network and the King's Global Institute for Women's leadership for organizing this event and providing me with the opportunity to share some of my work with you. So my essay focuses on women's political representations, which raises two central questions. The first one is about standing for women, that is having representatives that resemble women in terms of gender. The second one, so this is called descriptive representation. The second question is that of acting for women, that is having representative that acts in women's interests regardless of their gender, and that is called substantive representation. My essay attempted to explore the intersection of these two questions by looking at what I thought was a fascinating topic. Do women party leaders represent women's interests better? Indeed, in Western Europe, we see a growing number of women leading political parties. Interestingly, many of these women lead far-right populist parties, which have historically opposed policies that promote women's interests, such as reproductive rights and women's equal access to the labor market. In this context, it's crucial to understand whether their leadership influences the party's positions on feminist policies. So my essay delves into this topic by focusing on Marine Le Pen, who's the leader of the French far-right party, the National Rally, to explore the influence she's had on her party stances on issues affecting women. So the first question I aimed to address was, does Marine Le Pen speak for women? During her father's tenure, the party strongly promoted a traditional view of women's role in society, advocating for pro-nativist policies and taking a clear anti-feminist stance. Jean-Marie Le Pen even famously declared that women's bodies belong to the nation. In contrast to that, Marine Le Pen has softened this rhetoric, attempting to present the National Rally as a more mainstream party and attempting to appeal to working women, whereas her father only referred to women as housewives and mothers. However, while she's adjusted the tone, she hasn't fundamentally changed the message. Her efforts fall short of true advocacy for women, as her discourse rarely include any mention of women or any meaningful support for women's rights. The second question I was interested in was whether she acts for women, especially looking at whether she championed policies such as abortion liberalization. While her father was vocally into abortion, Marine Le Pen failed to take a clear stand on the issue. During the debates on the incorporation of abortion rights into the French Constitution, she failed to give a voting recommendation to her MPs. And while she voted in favor, more than a third of her MPs either abstained or voted against it. So while she has moderated the party's stance compared to her father's leadership, she hasn't actively championed women's policies and promoted women's rights. In essence, my essay demonstrated that in this case, women leaders of far-right populist parties do not necessarily enhance women's political representation and feminist policies. So I hope this overview gave you some insight into this fascinating topic. Tonight is also a special night for me because it's my first time back at King's since graduating in August. And I'm now pursuing my studies by doing an MPhil in European Politics and Society at the University of Oxford, where my work focuses on EU foreign policy. It feels good to be back and to meet so many inspiring speakers and students, so thanks once again for having me.
Oh, God, did that well. Just ignore me while I wreck things. What could possibly go wrong? Water and electricity, just as you were, I'm sure. Don't get too close. But fortunately, I haven't done anything bad to your certificate, so if you want to come forward, there we go. There we are. Congratulations, it's terrific.
Fantastic. And now I am delighted to announce our first place winner. The top prize goes to Ruth Oteem for her outstanding essay exploring whether participation is best explained by differences in welfare state defamiliarization. I knew I wasn't going to get that word. Policies. Ruth, please come to the stage and share your work with us and tell us how to pronounce that word.
I'm beyond honored to be able to accept this prize in celebration of the work and life of Brenda Trenowden, so it's a complete honor that I'm here. I also want to thank the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership, the Gender Studies Network, and Feminist Perspectives as well. Dr. Hannah Kleider at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy for teaching me comparative social policy last year, and the wonderful people on this stage and behind the scenes that made this all possible. My essay is titled, Is Cross-National Variation in Female Labor Force Participation Best Explained by Differences in Welfare State Defamiliarization Policies? Which reminds me, it's really hard to say defamiliarization policies. It's far easier to write it. On a serious note, defamiliarization, coined by Lister in 1994 and articulated by Kleider 2015, to directly quote from my piece, is the extent to which a welfare state helps women seek paid employment and achieve financial independence from their partners. Aside from my feminist approach, I intended to also decolonize the Eurocentricity of most of these studies by focusing on Mexico and Chile. My hypothesis that the stronger the welfare state commitments to defamiliarization policies lead to higher female labor force participation draw on two essential approaches within the literature: equality of access, which eliminates gender discrimination, and substantive benefits, such as state-provided childcare and maternity leave. Using three operationalized indicators, social institutions and gender index, family benefits public spending, and maternity leave from the OECD, the essay findings suggest that, sorry, my friends are over there taking a picture, so got a little anxious. The essay findings suggest that substantial benefits, particularly maternity leave and SIGI, present mixed results, highlighting the need to consider non-European contexts in understanding female labor force participation dynamics. Ultimately, the essay argues that the extension of trends that we see in Eurocentric defamiliarization literature is limited to primarily substantive benefits, such as female family benefits public spending in the non-Western world. Looking to the future, beyond this room and my undergraduate, I aspire to engage in further academic study with a focus on amplifying the voices of global South women. It is not merely analyzing what their governments are doing for them. I look to making policy prescriptions in my future work within academia. I also aim to urge the Western world to truly listen and incorporate their stories, their perspectives, and cultural richness into global conversations about welfare, equality, and community. In order to aspire for such kind of a world, I want to take a step back to both reflect and thank my mother above all of this, for she's a definition, of resilience and intelligence that not only allowed me to talk to you here today, but pushed me to put her qualities into my own work with integrity and open-mindedness. My work fundamentally reroutes back to her. I hope that my future research and with academia doesn't treat women of the Global South like faceless statistics and passive subjects, but as active agents of change. I want to disrupt the status quo, ensuring that global feminist thought and policy reflects the lived realities of women everywhere, bringing their invaluable contributions in all of their languages, cultures, experiences, and beauty. Thank you.
All right. I'm ready for the picture.
Oh, I was trying too hard. Thank you. Thank you.
So congratulations to all of our amazing winners. Your work represents the kind of rigorous, thoughtful scholarship that advances feminist discourse and understanding. Your innovative research truly advances feminist scholarship, and we're privileged to have your voices in this important discourse, even more important than usual. Thank you all for your contributions to this critical field of study. I also want to thank all of those who donated to support this wonderful and important prize, many of whom are here in the room, as well as the incredible committee that have put this together, Mel Richards, Sarah Gordon, and the whole team at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership who helped make this evening possible. So I am pleased to now invite you all to stay and celebrate with us over refreshments. It'll be a wonderful opportunity to discuss these fascinating research projects with our winners and to collect your copy, don't forget them, of their published essays. It's a testament to the exceptional scholarship we've witnessed today. Thank you all for being part of this lovely celebration, both of Brenda's impact and that of these scholars. Enjoy.